Turkey has the second largest army in NATO. Israel has the most combat-experienced air force in the Middle East. And this week, the president of one threatened to invade the other. Most people watching this story think the question is, can Turkey actually do it? That is the wrong question. The right question is structural. Why does Erdogan keep making this threat even though the architecture of global power makes it almost impossible to execute? And more importantly, what does the answer to that question tell you about where the Middle East is actually going? Because here's the paradox that nobody in the mainstream media is explaining. Erdogan's threat against Israel is simultaneously the most powerful diplomatic weapon he has, and the most structurally constrained military option on the table. Understanding why both of those things are true at the same time tells you more about the new Middle East than anything you will read in the headlines today. I want to walk you through the structural analysis, not the rhetoric, not who called who a Hitler, the incentives, the game theory, and the structural history that explain what is actually happening and where it leads. The global order is shifting faster than the news cycle can report. Hit subscribe to stay ahead of the curve, because what I am about to show you changes everything. Let me start with what actually happened this week, because the facts matter before the analysis. On Saturday, April 12th, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan addressed the International Asia Political Parties Conference in Istanbul. He said Israel was carrying out atrocities, that Netanyahu was blinded by blood and hate, and then he said this: just as Turkey entered Libya and Karabakh, we can enter Israel. He added that there is nothing to prevent us from doing it. One of his ministers described Netanyahu as the Hitler of our time. Turkish prosecutors filed indictments against 35 senior Israeli officials, including Netanyahu himself. Israeli Defense Minister Katz called Erdogan a Muslim Brotherhood man who massacred Kurds. Netanyahu accused Turkey of accommodating Iran's terror regime and its proxies. That is the surface of the story. Now let me show you the structure beneath it. The first thing to understand is what Erdogan's threat actually is. Not militarily, structurally. Erdogan has been making some version of this threat since 2023, since Gaza began. He threatened intervention when Israel was operating in Lebanon. He referenced Libya and Karabakh. He said patience brings victory in response to crowds chanting, "Take us to Jerusalem." Each time the media covers it as escalation. Each time nothing happens militarily. And each time Erdogan's regional standing rises, his domestic approval holds, and his position as the self-appointed defender of Palestinian rights is reinforced across the Muslim world. This is not inconsistency. This is a deliberate structural strategy. The threat itself is the weapon, not the action. In game theory, this is called the credibility trap. A threat is most valuable when the target believes it might be executed. A threat that is obviously never going to be executed has zero deterrence value. So Erdogan has to keep the threat alive, keep it credible enough to matter, without ever crossing the threshold that would force him to either execute it or publicly back down. He is walking a razor's edge, and he has been walking it successfully for 2 years. Now, most analysts stop here and say Erdogan is just playing domestic politics. He is talking to his base. He is posturing. This is all rhetoric. And those analysts are partially right. But here is the reality. They are missing the structural transformation that makes this rhetoric genuinely dangerous in a way it was not 3 years ago. Now I want to go deeper because this is where most people's analysis completely breaks down. The second structural force is geography, and geography does not lie. Erdogan referenced Libya and Karabakh as models. Those references are not random. They are a specific template. In Libya in 2020, Turkey did not invade with conventional forces. Turkey sent drones, Turkish Bayraktar TB2s, advisory personnel, technical support, proxy fighters from Syria. Turkey changed the outcome of that conflict without a single Turkish soldier firing a weapon directly at an enemy combatant in open conventional battle. In Karabakh in 2020, Turkey provided Azerbaijan with exactly the same package: drones, intelligence, training, and Armenia's military, which had held that territory for decades, collapsed in 44 days. The question is not whether Turkey can launch a conventional amphibious invasion of Israel. Every serious military analyst agrees that scenario is implausible. The Israeli Air Force has clear operational superiority. Israel's naval capabilities would detect and destroy a Turkish amphibious force before it reached shore. The geography is wrong. The logistics are wrong. The military balance is wrong. But that is the wrong question. The question is whether Turkey can do to Israel what it did to Armenia. Not a frontal assault, a proxy war, a drone war, A war fought through Syria, through Hamas, through the Syrian National Army, through organizations that received Turkish weapons, Turkish training, Turkish intelligence, and Turkish political cover. While Turkish officials can stand at a podium and say with perfect legal accuracy that Turkey has not attacked Israel, Turkey already controls significant territory in northern Syria. Since the collapse of the Assad regime in late 2024, Ankara has become Syria's principal power broker. Turkish forces are deployed across thousands of square kilometers from Idlib to Ras Al Ain, and those Turkish forces are, by geography, positioned along Israel's northern operational perimeter. Turkish-backed forces in Syria are, right now, closer to Israeli territory than any Iranian proxy was before the current war began. Keep that geography in the back of your mind because we are coming back to it. The third structural force is the one that makes this genuinely novel, the NATO paradox. And this is the mechanism that the mainstream media is almost entirely failing to explain. Here is the structural situation. Turkey is a NATO member. Article 5 of the NATO treaty states that an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. If Israel were to strike Turkish territory, in theory, every NATO member would be obligated to consider a collective response. That includes the United States. The United States that is also Israel's closest strategic ally, that funds Israel's military, that has just fought a war alongside Israel against Iran. Think about what that institutional structure means in game theory terms. It means that Israel faces a constraint that it did not face against Iran, against Hezbollah, against Hamas, or against any other adversary in its history. Israel cannot simply strike Turkey the way it strikes its other enemies, because a strike on Turkey activates a treaty mechanism that would force the United States to simultaneously be at war with its closest ally and obligated to defend the country it just attacked. This is not a theoretical problem. This week, when an Iranian missile entered Turkish airspace during the early days of the Iran war in March, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was asked whether Article 5 applied. His response was immediate. Nobody is talking about Article 5, because even in that case, where Turkey was the victim of a missile strike, invoking Article 5 was structurally too complicated. The United States was the one fighting Iran. NATO was not going to declare war on Iran on behalf of Turkey. At the same time, America was bombing Iranian nuclear facilities. But that incident proved something extremely important. It proved that Article 5 is not automatic. It is political. It requires consensus. It can be blocked. And it revealed a fracture in the alliance's architecture that both Erdogan and Netanyahu have now seen in real time. Now here is where the analysis gets deeply structural. The Article 5 paradox cuts both ways. Yes, it constrains Israel from striking Turkey directly, but it also constrains Turkey from attacking Israel directly. Because if Turkey attacks Israel and Israel retaliates against Turkish territory, Turkey cannot invoke Article 5 as the aggressor. You cannot start a war and then demand that your allies defend you from the consequences. The treaty explicitly covers defensive situations. An offensive operation launched by Turkey against Israel would not qualify. So both sides are caught in the same institutional trap. Israel cannot strike Turkey without activating a mechanism that paralyzes its primary sponsor. Turkey cannot attack Israel without forfeiting the very protection that gives its threats their strategic weight. This is the structural paradox at the heart of the Turkey-Israel confrontation. Both sides benefit from the threat environment. Neither side can afford the action. Real families in Israel are building bomb shelters and calculating evacuation routes, not because of Iran, which is now under ceasefire, but because Turkish drones in a Syrian proxy configuration represent a threat that no existing Israeli defense architecture was specifically designed to handle. Real Turkish citizens are being told by their government that their country stands as the defender of Palestinian rights, that Erdogan is the voice of the Muslim world, that Turkey's strength is what protects the region from Israeli expansionism. These are not abstract political claims to the people hearing them. These are identity claims. And identity claims, once made loudly enough and repeatedly enough, create their own pressure toward action that the original speaker may not have intended. The fourth structural force is the one that keeps this crisis escalating, regardless of what anyone decides in Ankara or Jerusalem. It is the vacuum. Iran's regional axis, what analysts call the Shia crescent running from Tehran through Baghdad, through Damascus, through Beirut to Gaza, has been structurally broken by the current war. Hezbollah has been degraded. The Iranian military has been struck. The Syrian regime that anchored the axis is gone. The network of proxies that Iran spent 40 years building is now operating without a functioning central sponsor. That vacuum is enormous, and Erdogan sees it. For 2 decades, the dominant non-state power projection in the Middle East was Iranian. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi in Yemen, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These organizations gave Iran influence far beyond its borders, at a fraction of the cost of conventional military power. Now that model is broken. Erdogan's strategic ambition is to replace the Iranian model with a Turkish version. Not Shia-led, Sunni-led, not proxy organizations aligned with Tehran. Organizations aligned with Ankara. The Hamas Political Bureau has long operated out of Istanbul. Syrian rebel groups that Turkey backs are already positioned in the territory that borders Israel. Turkey is actively negotiating a formal defense pact with the new Syrian government that would allow Turkish troops in advanced air defense systems to be permanently stationed in Syrian territory. In structural history terms, this is exactly the dynamic that preceded the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, but in reverse. The British Empire moved into every vacuum left by Ottoman retreat. Military advisors, economic relationships, infrastructure investment, political alignment, not conquest, presence, influence, the patient accumulation of strategic position before the moment of decisive advantage arrives. Erdogan is running the same playbook in the other direction, moving into every vacuum left by Iran's retreat, not with armies, with drones, with diplomacy, with rhetoric that consolidates Muslim world opinion behind Turkish leadership. Erdogan told the conference crowd that Turkey's GDP had reached a record $1.1 trillion, and that economic strength is what allows Turkey to extend its influence and military reach. He was not talking to the conference. He was talking to every Sunni Muslim government watching the speech. Now let me tell you what the Peloponnesian War has to do with any of this. In the 5th century BC, after Athens was finally broken by the long war with Sparta, the Greek world did not stabilize. It fragmented. City-state competed against city-state. Alliances formed and dissolved. The old hegemon was gone. The new powers were competing for position. And in the middle of all that competition, a previously marginal power, Macedon, was doing exactly what Erdogan is doing today. Building military capability, accumulating economic strength, positioning its rhetoric as the voice of Greek unity while quietly undermining every rival. Philip of Macedon did not conquer Greece in battle. He filled the vacuum that exhausted competitors left behind. The parallel to 2026 is not that Erdogan is Philip of Macedon. The parallel is that the structure of the moment, the exhausted hegemon, the broken regional order, the competing middle powers, the vacuum of influence, is the kind of structure in which a patient and transactional operator can achieve outsized gains without ever fighting the war his rhetoric implies. Here is what the incentives actually tell you about where this goes. Erdogan's incentives are clear. He needs to keep the threat credible without triggering consequences he cannot manage. He needs to position Turkey as the Sunni world's indispensable power before the Iran-US ceasefire solidifies a new regional order that leaves Turkey on the sidelines. He needs to exploit the NATO paradox as leverage against both Washington and Jerusalem without actually invoking it, because invoking it would reveal its limits. And he needs to manage Turkey's own domestic politics, with the first post-Erdogan presidential election cycle approaching, and the Istanbul mayor, his most credible challenger, under arrest. Israel's incentives are equally clear but structurally constrained. Israel cannot tolerate Turkish military presence in Syria, expanding to the point where Turkish air defense systems restrict Israeli freedom of operation over Syrian, Iraqi, and potentially Iranian territory. Israel is already building a counter-strategy through Athens and Nicosia, using the Greece-Cyprus-Israel trilateral alignment as a flanking deterrent in the eastern Mediterranean to contain Turkish naval ambitions without direct confrontation. Israel is also watching Turkey's military modernization program, the Eurofighter deal with the United Kingdom, the potential acquisition of used Typhoons from UAE and Oman, the development of Typhoon and Cenk medium-range ballistic missiles, the Steel Dome air defense initiative. These are not the preparations of a country that intends to invade Israel next month. These are the preparations of a country that is systematically addressing the capability gaps that currently prevent it from being a credible conventional threat to Israel, so that in 5 or 10 years, the threat is no longer just rhetoric. Now you tell me who is more constrained by the current architecture of power and who is more strategically flexible. The United States, trapped between its obligations to both countries, Watching a NATO ally and its closest Middle East partner escalate toward each other while Washington is simultaneously managing a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a ceasefire with Iran, a May summit with Xi Jinping, a Supreme Court disabled tariff regime, and a domestic political environment where 60% of Americans now hold unfavorable views of Israel. That is not a country with the bandwidth to manage a Turkey-Israel crisis in parallel with everything else on its plate. Watch 4 things in the coming weeks. Watch the Syria friction points. The critical variable is whether Turkish-backed forces and Israeli forces operating in Syrian territory come into direct contact. Both governments have reportedly established a deconfliction mechanism. But deconfliction mechanisms depend on communication channels, and communication channels depend on political will to use them. If Erdogan's rhetoric continues to escalate and Israeli operations in Syria expand, the risk of an unintended incident rises regardless of anyone's intentions. Watch the Turkish military procurement timeline, Turkey's Eurofighter deal, its missile development program, and its air defense investments are not immediate threats to Israel. They are signals about where Turkey intends to be militarily in 3 to 5 years. The speed of that procurement tells you how seriously Ankara is preparing for a scenario beyond rhetoric. Watch Washington's response. The Trump administration has strong ties to Israel and has been publicly critical of Erdogan. But the United States also needs Turkey's NATO cooperation, needs access to Incirlik Air Base, needs Turkish support for the Hormuz coalition it is trying to assemble. How Washington calibrates its response to the Erdogan-Netanyahu exchange will tell you whether America is going to actively manage this tension or allow it to compound. Watch Erdogan's domestic calendar. Turkey's next presidential election cycle begins within 2 years, and Erdogan, facing a genuine electoral challenge for the first time in his political career, has strong incentives to escalate nationalist and Islamist rhetoric, to pick fights he does not have to finish, to manufacture the kind of crisis that consolidates his base. A politician approaching an election with his most credible opponent in jail and his economic record under pressure is a politician with incentives to keep foreign policy crises alive rather than resolve them. The structural conclusion from all of this is not that Turkey will invade Israel. The military analysis is clear. Turkey cannot successfully execute a conventional amphibious operation against Israel. The Israeli Air Force, intelligence capability, and naval deterrence make that scenario implausible under current conditions. The structural conclusion is something more unsettling. Turkey does not need to invade Israel to fundamentally change Israel's security environment. Turkey needs only to embed itself deeply enough in Syrian territory, arm enough Syrian proxies with enough capability, and build enough of a conventional deterrent to make Israel recalculate the cost of operating freely across the northern arc. That process is already underway. It does not require an invasion. It requires patience. Erdogan told that crowd something that I think deserves to be taken seriously as a strategic statement rather than dismissed as rhetoric. Patience brings victory. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. I might be wrong about the timeline. I might be wrong about whether Washington eventually forces a de-escalation that changes the trajectory. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. But the structural pressures I have described here, the NATO paradox, the Syrian vacuum, the proxy model, the domestic political incentives, these are real and they are operating right now. Subscribe if this kind of structural analysis is useful to you, because this story is far from over and the mainstream version of it is missing the most important parts.